It was a quiet evening in a small, peaceful town. The streets were mostly empty, with only the occasional sound of leaves rustling in the wind. A stray cat wandered along the pavement, its sleek black fur glinting faintly under the streetlights. To anyone passing by, it would seem like just another stray, aimlessly roaming the streets. But this cat had a purpose. Not far away, 2 police officers were sitting in their patrol car. Officer Daniels, a seasoned cop with years of experience, leaned back in his seat, sipping his coffee. Beside him sat Officer Carter, a new recruit, eager and curious about the world of law enforcement. Their shift had been uneventful so far, just the way Daniels liked it. But as they talked, the cat appeared out of nowhere, standing directly in front of their car. At first, neither officer paid much attention. Daniels glanced at the cat and shrugged, assuming it was just another stray. But Carter noticed something odd. The cat wasn't just standing there. It was meowing loudly and pacing back and forth, almost as if it was trying to get their attention. Carter leaned forward, watching the animal closely. "Do you see this?" she asked. Daniels sighed and turned his head, giving the cat a cursory glance. "It's just a cat," he said dismissively. But Carter wasn't convinced. Something about the cat's behavior felt deliberate. It didn't run away or seem afraid. Instead, it kept meowing, glancing between the officers and the direction it came from. Curiosity got the better of Carter. She stepped out of the car and crouched down, trying to get a closer look at the cat. The cat stopped meowing for a moment and locked eyes with her. Then, without warning, it turned and began walking away, stopping every few steps to look back at her. "I think it wants us to follow," Carter said, half joking. Daniels rolled his eyes but reluctantly followed her lead. The cat led them through a series of narrow alleyways. As they walked, Carter couldn't help but notice the strange determination in the animal's movements. It didn't hesitate or wander. It seemed to know exactly where it was going. Daniels, though skeptical, began to feel a growing unease. The further they walked, the darker and quieter the surroundings became. Along the way, they started noticing small, unsettling details. A broken branch here, a discarded shoe there, things that seemed out of place in an otherwise quiet neighborhood. Carter's instincts told her they were heading toward something important, though she couldn't quite say what. Daniels, despite his earlier skepticism, began to feel the same. Finally, the cat stopped in front of an old, abandoned house. The windows were shattered, the door hung loosely on its hinges, and the entire structure exuded an eerie, foreboding presence. The cat sat down at the entrance, looking back at the officers as if to say, "This is it." Carter and Daniels exchanged a glance. Without speaking, they knew they had to investigate. As they stepped inside, their flashlights illuminated a space that felt frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture, scattered debris, and faint traces of something recent, a disturbance that didn't belong. In the center of the room, they found something that made their hearts race. It was evidence of a crime, unmistakable and chilling. They immediately radioed for backup, their voices steady but urgent. While they secured the scene and waited for help to arrive, the cat sat quietly in a corner, watching everything unfold. Once the situation was under control, Carter knelt down to the cat and gently stroked its head. "You really are something, aren't you?" she whispered. The cat purred softly, as if acknowledging her gratitude. Daniels, who had been skeptical from the start, nodded in agreement. "I'll admit it," he said. "This little guy saved the day." As the officers wrapped up their work, the cat slipped away into the night, disappearing as mysteriously as it had arrived. Though they never saw it again, neither officer would forget the night a stray cat guided them to a terrifying discovery and reminded them that heroes can come in the most unexpected forms. The cat moved closer to the patrol car, its cries growing louder and more insistent. It wasn't the kind of meowing you'd expect from a stray looking for food or attention. This was different. There was urgency, almost desperation, in the way the animal carried itself. It stopped just a few feet in front of the car, staring directly at the officers with piercing green eyes. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to communicate something. "Do you see this?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and unease. Daniels barely looked up from his coffee, letting out a tired sigh. It's a cat, Carter. Strays do weird things all the time. Let it go. But Carter couldn't. Something about the cat's behavior felt deliberate, almost calculated. She opened the car door and stepped out, crouching slightly to get a closer look. The cat paused, its meowing briefly stopping as it made direct eye contact with her. Then, without warning, it turned and began to walk away, its tail swishing low to the ground. It didn't wander off like a typical stray. Instead, it walked a few paces, stopped, and turned back to look at her, as if waiting for her to follow. "I think it wants us to follow it," Carter said, half joking but unable to ignore the thought. Daniels rolled his eyes but set his coffee down reluctantly. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, but when Carter took a few steps after the cat, he had no choice but to get out of the car and follow. The cat led them down a side street, its movements steady and purposeful. The streetlights began to thin out, leaving long stretches of shadow between each pool of dim light. As they walked, the air grew colder, and the silence around them felt heavier. Daniels grumbled under his breath, but even he couldn't deny there was something unusual about the way the cat moved, pausing every so often to ensure they were still behind it. The further they went, the stranger things became. The cat led them through a narrow alley, where Carter noticed faint scratches along the walls, as though someone, or something, had been there recently. At one point, she spotted a crumpled piece of fabric caught on a rusted fence. She stopped to examine it briefly, but the cat let out a sharp meow, urging them to keep moving. Daniels finally spoke up, his tone low and cautious. "This is starting to feel off. Are you sure about this?" Carter didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure of anything, but her instincts told her they couldn't stop now. The cat led them to the edge of a park, where the path became overgrown with weeds and the trees seemed to close in overhead. The shadows were darker here, the silence even more unnerving. As they moved deeper into the park, Daniels began to feel an unfamiliar unease creeping over him. He kept glancing around, his hand instinctively moving to the flashlight on his belt. Finally, the cat stopped. It sat down in the middle of a clearing, its eyes fixed on something ahead. Carter and Daniels followed its gaze, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. What they saw made both of them freeze. Ahead of them stood an old, dilapidated house, its roof partially caved in and its windows shattered. The structure looked like it hadn't been touched in years, yet something about it felt alive with an unsettling energy. The cat remained perfectly still, its gaze locked on the house as if waiting for the officers to make their move. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got to be kidding me. This is where it was leading us?" Carter nodded, her own unease growing with every second. But despite the fear bubbling inside her, she couldn't ignore the pull to investigate. They approached the house cautiously, their flashlights casting shifting beams of light across the broken wood and jagged edges. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind nudged it. Daniels hesitated, glancing at Carter. "We should call this in," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. But Carter shook her head. "Let's just take a quick look. If something feels wrong, we'll call it in immediately." With a deep breath, they stepped inside. The air inside the house was thick and stale, carrying the faint smell of decay. Dust particles floated in the beams of their flashlights as the floorboards groaned under their weight. They scanned the room, their breaths shallow and quiet, their senses heightened. And then they saw it. In the center of the room, surrounded by scattered debris, was something that sent chills down their spines. It was evidence, unmistakable and horrifying, that a crime had taken place here. Daniels immediately reached for his radio, calling for backup with a calm but urgent tone. Carter, meanwhile, kept her eyes on the cat, which had wandered into the room and was now sitting silently in the corner, watching everything unfold. It seemed almost satisfied, as if it had done its part. Minutes later, the house was swarming with officers and investigators, piecing together the horrifying scene. Carter and Daniels stood outside, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The cat sat at Carter's feet, purring softly. She knelt down and scratched behind its ears. "I don't know how or why you did it," she murmured, "but you might have just saved someone's life tonight." Daniels, who had been skeptical from the start, nodded in agreement. "I've seen a lot of things in my time, but this is something else." As the chaos of the investigation continued, the cat stood up and began to walk away. Carter watched it disappear into the shadows, its sleek form blending into the night. She didn't try to stop it. Some mysteries, she thought, were better left unsolved. That night, as they filed their report, neither officer could shake the feeling that they'd witnessed something extraordinary. The cat had led them to a terrifying discovery, but it had also reminded them of an important truth. Sometimes, help comes from the most unexpected places. It was a quiet night in a small, uneventful town, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional flicker of a streetlight or the distant bark of a dog. The air was crisp, and the silence carried a strange weight, as though the town itself was holding its breath. For Officer Daniels and Officer Carter, it was just another routine patrol, a night like countless others, or so they thought. Daniels, a seasoned officer with decades on the force, leaned back in the driver's seat, sipping his coffee. He appreciated these calm nights, free from the chaos he'd seen in his early years. Beside him, Carter, the rookie with just a few months of experience, kept her eyes on the road ahead, her enthusiasm untempered by the monotony of their shift. She had a knack for noticing things others overlooked, and tonight would prove to be no different. As they idled at a stop sign, Carter's gaze caught something in the distance. A shadow moved just beyond the reach of the streetlights, low to the ground, weaving deliberately across the road. She squinted, trying to make out the shape. "Daniels," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Look at that." Daniels followed her line of sight, barely glancing before dismissing it. "It's just a cat," he said flatly, taking another sip of his coffee. But Carter kept watching. The cat wasn't behaving like any stray she'd seen before. It wasn't darting around aimlessly or sniffing at trash. Instead, it seemed purposeful. The cat moved closer, stepping into the light. Its sleek black coat glistened under the glow of the street lamp, and its piercing green eyes locked onto the patrol car. It let out a loud, sharp meow that echoed unnervingly in the empty street. Carter leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "It's trying to get our attention," she said, almost to herself. Daniels chuckled, shaking his head. "You're reading too much into it. Cats meow. That's what they do." But Carter wasn't convinced. The cat's cries were insistent, almost demanding. It paced in front of the car, its movements sharp and deliberate, like it was trying to lead them somewhere. Finally, Carter couldn't take it anymore. She opened the door and stepped out, her boots crunching against the gravel. The cat froze, its gaze fixed on her. Then it let out another meow before turning and walking away, glancing back over its shoulder every few steps. "I think it wants us to follow," Carter said, half joking but unable to ignore the strange pull she felt. Daniels groaned but put down his coffee and got out of the car. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's humor the cat, but if this leads to a dumpster, you're buying coffee." The cat led them down a narrow side street, its movements precise and purposeful. The further they followed, the darker and quieter the surroundings became. The streetlights grew sparser, their dim glow casting long, eerie shadows. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. As they walked, Carter began to notice subtle, unsettling details. A broken branch lay across the path, splintered unnaturally. A discarded scarf was tangled in the bushes, torn at one end. She pointed these out to Daniels, who dismissed them with a shrug, but she could see the tension creeping into his posture. The cat continued on, leading them into an overgrown park at the edge of town. The trees loomed overhead, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The path was barely visible, swallowed by weeds and shadows. Carter's flashlight cut through the darkness, but it did little to dispel the growing sense of unease. "Carter," Daniels said, his voice low and uneasy, "we should call this in. This is getting weird. Carter nodded but didn't stop walking. Something deep inside her told her they had to see this through. The cat suddenly stopped at the edge of a clearing. It sat down, its green eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, and stared straight ahead. Carter and Daniels followed its gaze. Their flashlights illuminated a house, or what was left of one. The structure was barely standing, its roof caved in, and its windows shattered. Vines crept up the walls, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. The entire scene felt wrong, as though the house itself was alive with a dark, oppressive energy. "This is where it's been leading us?" Daniels asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. Carter nodded, her grip tightening on her flashlight. She couldn't explain it, but she knew they had to go inside. They stepped cautiously through the broken doorway, their flashlights cutting through the suffocating darkness. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the faint stench of decay. Every step echoed through the empty space, the creak of the floorboards making the silence even more unbearable. As they moved deeper into the house, Carter noticed faint signs of recent activity. A chair was tipped over, its legs splintered. Papers were scattered across the floor, some of them torn and crumpled. On one wall, there were deep scratches, as though someone, or something, had clawed at the surface in desperation. Then they saw it. In the center of the room was something that made their blood run cold. It was evidence, undeniable and horrifying, that a crime had been committed here. Carter's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the scene, her mind racing. Daniels broke the silence, his voice tight. "We need backup. Now!" He reached for his radio, his hands trembling slightly as he called it in. Carter, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene, noticed the cat sitting silently in the corner, its gaze fixed on them. It didn't move or make a sound, but its presence was almost knowing. Within minutes, the house was swarming with officers and investigators, their voices and movements breaking the oppressive silence. Carter and Daniels stepped outside, both visibly shaken. The cat, still sitting at the doorway, finally stood and stretched. Carter knelt down, reaching out to stroke its sleek fur. "I don't know how you knew," she whispered, "but you brought us here for a reason." The cat purred softly, its eyes closing briefly before it turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quietly as it had appeared. As Carter watched it go, she felt a strange mix of gratitude and awe. Daniel stood beside her, shaking his head. "In all my years I've never seen anything like this," he said. "A cat leading us to something like that. I don't even know how to explain it." Carter didn't respond. She didn't need to. Some things, she realized, defied explanation. That night, the cat had led them to a terrifying discovery, but it had also reminded them of something profound. Sometimes, help comes from the most unexpected places and in the most mysterious ways. The night was still and heavy with an eerie calm, as though the entire town was holding its breath. Officer Daniels and Officer Carter were sitting in their patrol car, the faint glow of their dashboard lights illuminating their faces. Daniels leaned back in his seat, the lines on his face softened by the routine quiet of the shift. Beside him, Carter's sharp gaze swept over the empty streets, her rookie instincts making her alert to even the smallest details. It was just past midnight when something unusual broke the monotony. Carter noticed movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow slipping across the edge of a streetlight's glow. She leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. There, barely visible, was a black cat pacing back and forth in the middle of the road. Its sleek coat caught the faint light, and its piercing green eyes reflected like two tiny beacons in the night. "Look at that," Carter said, tapping Daniels on the arm. Daniels glanced up, unimpressed. "It's just a stray," he said dismissively. But Carter kept watching. The cat wasn't behaving like a typical stray. Its movements were too purposeful, too deliberate. It stopped pacing and sat down, staring directly at the patrol car, its cries sharp and insistent, cutting through the silence of the night. Carter furrowed her brow. "It's trying to get our attention." Daniels gave a short laugh. "It's a cat. That's what they do." but the tone of her voice made him glance at the animal again. The cat's posture, the urgency in its cries, it was enough to make even the skeptical Daniels pause. "I'm going to check it out," Carter said, opening her door before Daniels could protest. She stepped out and approached the cat cautiously. It stopped meowing as she got closer, locking eyes with her. Then, as if deciding something, it stood and began to walk away, its tail swishing low. Every few steps, it turned to look back at her, as if making sure she was following. "Carter, you're seriously following a cat now?" Daniels called after her, but his tone had lost its edge. Carter ignored him, her curiosity too strong to resist. With a sigh, Daniels grabbed his flashlight and followed. "If this leads us to a trash can, you owe me breakfast," he muttered. The cat led them down an unfamiliar street, its movements steady and purposeful. The further they followed, the quieter and darker their surroundings became. The streetlights grew sparse, and the faint hum of distant traffic faded into silence. As they walked, Carter began noticing subtle, unsettling signs. A shoe lay abandoned on the side of the road, its laces frayed and dirty. A child's toy, broken and weathered, sat in the gutter. The cat didn't pause, didn't hesitate. It simply kept moving forward, its path unwavering. Daniels couldn't hide his growing unease. "This is starting to feel off," he said, his voice lower now. Carter nodded silently, gripping her flashlight tighter. The night seemed heavier here, the air colder. The cat led them to the edge of an old park, the entrance overgrown with weeds and vines. Beyond the iron gate the path was barely visible, swallowed by the encroaching forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches forming a jagged canopy that blocked out even the faintest starlight. The cat paused briefly at the gate, glancing back at the officers before slipping through the bars. Carter hesitated for a moment, the weight of the darkness ahead pressing down on her. "We've come this far," she said quietly, more to herself than to Daniels. He sighed, shaking his head, but followed her through the gate. Inside the park, the silence was oppressive. Every step they took seemed to echo, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot unnaturally loud. Carter's flashlight beams swept over the path, illuminating faint scratches on the trees and pieces of debris scattered among the undergrowth. She pointed them out to Daniels, whose face grew graver with each discovery. The cat led them to a small clearing, its movements slowing as it neared the edge. It stopped and sat down, its tail curling around its paws. Carter and Daniels followed its gaze, their flashlights illuminating an old, crumbling house that stood in the center of the clearing. The house was barely standing, its roof sagging under the weight of decay. The windows were shattered, their jagged edges catching the faint light, and the door hung open at an awkward angle. The structure exuded a sense of foreboding, as though it had absorbed years of secrets and shadows. Daniels took a deep breath, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "You've got to be kidding me. This is where it led us?" Carter didn't answer. She felt the same unease, but she also felt something else, an inexplicable pull, as though they were meant to be here. They stepped cautiously toward the house, the cat following close behind. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. Dust coated every surface, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. The light from their flashlights revealed overturned furniture, shattered glass, and faint traces of something recent, something out of place in the otherwise abandoned space. Then, in the center of the room, they saw it. Evidence. Clear, undeniable evidence of a crime. Carter's stomach tightened as her flashlight illuminated the scene, and Daniels let out a low curse under his breath. Daniels grabbed his radio, his voice steady but urgent as he called for backup. Carter, meanwhile, couldn't take her eyes off the cat. It had settled in a corner of the room, watching them with an almost knowing expression. Minutes later, the house was alive with activity. Officers and investigators swarmed the space, documenting every detail. Outside, Carter and Daniels stood in the cold night air, the weight of what they'd discovered settling over them. The cat sat at Carter's feet, purring softly. She crouched down, gently stroking its head. "You knew, didn't you?" she murmured. The cat blinked slowly, its green eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Daniels shook his head, his disbelief clear. "In all my years, I've never seen anything like this," he said. "A cat leading us to this? How do you even explain it?" Carter didn't answer. She didn't need to. The cat stood, stretched, and walked off into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. As they watched it go, both officers felt a strange mixture of awe and gratitude. That night, they had uncovered something truly horrifying, but they had also witnessed something extraordinary, something that reminded them of the mysteries that lie just beyond the edges of what we understand. The clock on the dashboard read 2:13 a.m. when Officer Daniels and Officer Carter found themselves parked at the edge of town. The night was quiet, unnervingly so, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. Daniels, the veteran officer, was leaning back in his seat, his eyes half closed as he sipped his coffee. Carter, the rookie with boundless energy, was wide awake, her sharp eyes scanning the empty streets. It was supposed to be an uneventful night, the kind where the biggest excitement was a stray dog knocking over a trash can. But as Carter stared into the shadows beyond the streetlights, she spotted something that made her sit up straighter. "Daniels," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Do you see that?" Daniels groaned, opening one eye. "See what?" he asked, barely interested. "There," Carter insisted, pointing toward the edge of a nearby alley. Daniels followed her gaze and finally saw it, a black cat, sitting perfectly still in the dim light. Its sleek coat seemed to absorb the darkness around it, and its glowing green eyes were fixed on their patrol car. "It's just a cat," Daniels said dismissively, taking another sip of coffee. But Carter didn't look away. Something about the cat felt off. It wasn't the way it stared at them, unblinking and intense. It wasn't even the way it seemed to be waiting for something. It was the strange, heavy feeling that settled over her the longer she looked at it. The cat let out a single sharp meow. The sound echoed in the stillness, louder than it should have been. Then it stood, turned, and began to walk away, pausing after a few steps to look back at them. "It's leading us somewhere," Carter said, almost to herself. Daniels let out a dry laugh. "You think the cat wants us to follow it? Carter, it's the middle of the night. Cats do weird things all the time." But Carter was already opening her door. She stepped out of the car and approached the cat cautiously. It didn't run or hiss. It just stood there, waiting. Daniels muttered something under his breath and followed her. "If this leads us to a dead rat or a pile of garbage, I'm blaming you," he said. The cat began to move again, this time with purpose. It led them through the narrow alley, its paws silent against the cracked pavement. The deeper they went, the more unsettling their surroundings became. The alley walls were covered in graffiti, some of it old and faded, some of it fresh and angry-looking. A broken streetlight flickered overhead, casting distorted shadows that danced eerily on the walls. Carter noticed strange details as they followed the cat. A torn piece of fabric snagged on a jagged metal pipe, a shattered cell phone lying in a puddle, its screen spiderwebbed with cracks. Daniels was starting to feel uneasy too, though he didn't want to admit it. "Carter," he said, his voice low, "maybe we should call this in. Something doesn't feel right." But Carter was focused on the cat. It moved with such intent, pausing only to look back at them, as if making sure they were still following. They emerged from the alley and found themselves in an overgrown lot at the edge of an abandoned industrial area. The buildings around them were skeletal remains, their windows broken and their walls crumbling with age. The cat led them to the largest building, a towering structure that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Its massive metal doors were rusted and slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. The cat stopped just outside the entrance and sat down, its green eyes reflecting the dim light. "This is where it wants us to go?" Daniels asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Carter nodded, her heart pounding. "I think so." They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The air was heavy and stale, carrying the faint scent of mold and rust. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, rusted tools, and scraps of paper that crunched under their boots. As they moved deeper into the building, The atmosphere grew more oppressive. The shadows seemed to shift and crawl along the walls, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a scream. Carter's flashlight beam landed on a set of stairs leading down into the basement. The cat appeared beside her, silent and still, its gaze fixed on the stairs. It let out another sharp meow before padding down into the darkness. "Absolutely not," Daniel said, shaking his head. "There's no way I'm going down there." But Carter couldn't turn back now. "We've come this far," she said, trying to steady her voice. "We have to see this through." With Daniels reluctantly following, they descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was vast and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Their flashlights swept over the space, revealing rows of old machinery covered in dust and cobwebs. Then they saw it. In the center of the room was a circle of strange symbols etched into the concrete floor, surrounded by melted candles and other objects they couldn't immediately identify. The air felt thick with something they couldn't explain, something that made their skin crawl. Carter's breath hitched as her flashlight caught something else, a set of deep scratches along the wall, as though something had clawed its way out of the circle. Daniels grabbed his radio, his voice trembling as he called for backup. "We need someone down here now," he said, unable to keep the panic out of his voice. As they waited for reinforcements, the cat sat silently at the edge of the room, its green eyes watching them intently. It didn't move or make a sound, but its presence was strangely comforting, as though it had brought them here for a reason. When the other officers arrived, the scene turned into a flurry of activity. Investigators photographed every detail, their hushed voices filled with tension. Carter and Daniels stood outside, trying to process what they'd seen. The cat brushed against Carter's leg, purring softly before walking away. She watched it disappear into the shadows, a strange mix of gratitude and unease settling over her. "That cat knew," Daniels said quietly, breaking the silence. "It knew about all of this." Carter nodded, her thoughts racing. "I don't know how or why, but we wouldn't have found this without it." As they drove away, the weight of the night lingered over them. Whatever they had uncovered, it was just the beginning. But one thing was certain, the cat had led them to the truth, and the truth was more terrifying than they could have imagined. As they drove away from the scene, the flashing lights of the other patrol cars gradually faded in the rearview mirror, and the oppressive weight of the night seemed to lift, at least for a moment. But the silence between Daniels and Carter was heavy, filled with questions that neither of them knew how to answer. Carter glanced over at Daniels, who was still gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and unease. "You think we'll ever know what really happened here?" she asked softly, the words hanging in the air. Daniels didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the road, his mind replaying the strange scene in the basement, the symbols, the scratches, the feeling that something ancient and dark had been disturbed. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "I don't know. Some things might never make sense. But I've been on this job long enough to know that nothing is ever really what it seems." Carter nodded, staring out the window. "And the cat?" Daniels hesitated. "That cat..." He shook his head slowly. "It wasn't just some random stray. It knew exactly what it was doing. I don't know how, but it led us there for a reason." As they drove further into the night, the town began to feel more like a distant memory, like the beginning of something far bigger. Carter glanced back once more, her thoughts racing with questions that had no answers. The cat had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the lingering sense that something had been uncovered, a mystery that still demanded to be solved. But one thing was certain, the night's events had changed them. The line between what was normal and what wasn't had blurred, and deep down, they both knew that whatever was out there, whatever had drawn them to that abandoned building, hadn't been fully revealed yet. The cat had been their guide, but the true story was still waiting to unfold. And as much as they wished for answers, the journey they'd started that night was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, but they both knew they couldn't turn back now. The shadows had deepened, and they were no longer alone in the dark. As the car disappeared into the night, we're left with more questions than answers. What really happened in that abandoned building? And what role did the mysterious cat play in it all? If you enjoyed this wild and eerie journey with us, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling stories. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching till the end, and we'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, stay safe, and remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved. Take care.